That's me. So you're asking yourself, why would I even bother with this? Why would I doing a perfectly good Nintendo Red Tent? It's because when I got it, it wasn't a perfectly good Nintendo Red Tent. In fact, none of these Red Tents were any good when I got them. Every single one of them needed a paint job. Every single one of them needed some dent and scratch repair. Every single one needed something. But when you pieced everything together, you couldn't make one working Nintendo Red Tent. So what you're left with at the end of the day is, well, do I want to piece together one perfectly good one and have a bunch of spare parts laying around? Or do I want to maximize the amount of use that these are going to get as is? The answer is pretty simple. If you have two Red Tents that on the outside are complete, why don't you make two working Red Tents? When you have a Red Tent, you limit yourself to either, number one, you have original hardware that consists of a handful of cartridges that'll work correctly on the Versus system. Number two, you do the play choice conversion, and a lot of people will do the play choice conversions because it opens up the ability to play more games that weren't available on the Versus unit system. Wanted to make something that I had never seen done before. So what you're left with is, okay, well, what do you do now? It started with the Hyperkin Retro HD consoles. Yes, it's the best option for a cheapskate. The store was able to provide me with these consoles for cost. Nobody wants to pay retail when they're not entirely sure that something is going to work or not. I ended up with two problems. You have the original Versus hardware. Now, Nintendo does some funky things when it comes to their monitors and their audio systems. And in the Red Tent in particular, the audio amplifier is built into your monitor. So when you scrap your monitors, or in my case, when you sell your monitors for literally more than you paid for your Red Tent, you lose your audio circuit. What I did is I found the cheapest set of 3.5-inch drivers that I could find. They were coaxial, they were low wattage, they were shielded, and I installed the amplifiers directly to the audio out of the consoles. Now, typically when you have an RCA coming out of a console, it's a non-amplified audio signal. These 15-watt amplifiers have volume knobs on them, so you can adjust your volume coming directly off of your console. Now, when I did this with the Hyperkins, Hyperkin is known for their audio emulation not being great. What other HD cheap consoles are there out there? Well, it turns out that there are a bunch. I got the Hyperkins for almost nothing. They weren't as good of an option as other manufacturers. So then I looked into Retrobit. It turns out that their 8-bit HD console, the audio and the palette is pretty good. I'm in $44 at this point to the Retrobit consoles. Scrap the Hyperkins. I'll find another use for those at some point, but I want to say that the Hyperkins at our cost were somewhere in the ballpark of like $18 or $19. I bought the Retrobit ones, and immediately I noticed a significant difference. Everything was sharper. I didn't have any line crawl. I didn't have any noise on the video. We ran into a problem when we were in the lobby. With Versus Castlevania, all it takes is for somebody to hit start, because these are set up for free play. Nobody has to put any money in these machines. People have a tendency to start playing a game and then they walk away from it. Versus games have no pause function for obvious reasons, because they're arcade games. Castlevania's timer has an annoying beep to let you know you're running out of time. On the games that are Nintendo games, they do have a pause function. They started a game that has no timer, so you have a game that's been sitting there doing nothing. So I implemented some relays that when the controller senses no input, the consoles will reset themselves after 5 minutes. The bar in our game lounge is really low. Now, you have two levels of gamers when it comes to arcades. You have the people that want to play the game, and you have the people that want to own the game. We already have a shitload of original games. I have a couple, the store has a bunch, and we try to rotate out this inventory, but the nice thing about having the Red Tent in the game lounge is we can rotate out the cartridges with store inventory, and it's idiot proof. The Versus cartridges are running original Versus ROMs with adjusted palettes to work on an NES, because NES games have different palettes than their Versus counterparts, unlike Play Choice, which is typically a regular Nintendo game. So now we have the why I did it, because it was cheap. I took the controllers that came with the consoles. I hardwired them to leaf switches. Now, granted, they're not the original leaf switches. Those I have. I have the original Nintendo leaf switches still. I have the original power supply still. I have the original wire harness for the one that had a wire harness. And the second one that I bought never came with monitors. It literally was just a shell that had the CPs. No joysticks, no buttons, no nothing. I have my original joysticks on my personal one that I have at home. And the reason I have my original joysticks is because you wouldn't believe how ridiculously expensive Nintendo joysticks have become. Almost all of them use a different joystick. Even though they look the same physically, they're not. I didn't see any reason to change joysticks that work perfectly fine. However, the one that's in the game lounge, the joysticks had a tendency to stick, and they're not very easy or cheap to rebuild. They're not like a typical Sanwa or a Hapsuzo joystick. You can't just take it apart and change a couple of things. There's bushings, there's springs, there's all sorts of crap. It's all made out of metals, and they all wear over time, and the kits, they're not cheap. You spend a lot of money rebuilding original joysticks. So then the other option is, well, what is close enough that's cheap, that's brand new? I found some Nintendo replacement joysticks from Mike's Arcade, and at first people were skeptical because they're just different enough that they don't like them. But the other problem people have is input lag. There's no input lag. I can tell you right now, even if there was, you would have to have robot eyes to find it. I have no complaints whatsoever. If you factor in the $125 I paid for this red tent with no motherboard in it, I have $40 into these Retrobit consoles, which came with the controllers. The joysticks on my personal one were reused. Or you're looking at $60 for 4 brand new joysticks from Mike's Arcade. And they do pretty much just go right in. I put a couple of washers in there to countersink it below the CPO, and they're hardwired into the controller boards that came with the Retrobit consoles. So then you plug those directly into the console and you've got that portion done. The only place it gets confusing is with your start and your select buttons. Now, there is some DIY with this. You have to make your own brackets to mount the monitors, which I did do. The first one that I made, I went as far as to powder coat the brackets. This one that I keep for myself at home, I didn't want to go through all that trouble because I'd already done it once before it dawned on me that it doesn't matter because you'll never see them. So these ones are just unfinished aluminum. The monitors, since these are a standard ratio VGA monitor, you can usually find now electronic wholesalers usually have these things in their leftovers from offices. These in particular came from an electronic wholesaler here in Phoenix. And since they're standard ratio monitors and they're VGA, they do not do HDMI. The seller can't even give them away. So I picked both monitors up for $10 each, and they were still brand new. They had plastic caps on the VGA end. The most expensive thing on my red tent is the chairs that I bought from IKEA. Those 2 chairs together almost cost more than my entire red tent project. Is it original hardware? No. Is it better than original hardware? It depends. What are your end goals? I can literally play my entire Nintendo library on my red tent right now. I just have to take any cartridge I want and plug it into my cartridge slot, and there we go. I have no PCBs, I have no hardware to change, I have nothing. I plug it in and I power it on and it works. And even if it wasn't that easy, that thing is so light, we travel well with it. Our red tent has been to Comic-Con. It's been to the Game On Expo in Phoenix. Because without those original monitors in it, it doesn't weigh anything anymore. And we've eliminated so much power waste that we've now created an eco-friendly red tent accidentally. But either way, I have no intention of ever putting these back to their original hardware.
You maniacs! God damn you all to hell!
I'll keep the original hardware in boxes in my garage, but when does progress start to work forward? It comes down to personal preference, and a lot of times it doesn't matter what you think because I like them and I own them.